Hey, I'm Casey Davidson. Welcome to the Put 'em Back podcast. We've got a really, really fun one for y'all today. We are joined by Brian Jones, the Vice President of the South Carolina Shrimpers Association. What's up, Brian? Thanks for being here.
I appreciate it. How's it going?
Good. So I met Brian a couple years ago. He invited me up to McClellanville, which is his hometown, to go on an amazing shrimp boat ride. Brought the whole family. I think it was for the Blessing of the Fleet. What a great time that was.
Yep.
What was that all about? This is a celebration of shrimpers in that community, or?
Yeah, so the Blessing of the Fleet in McClellanville is a long-standing tradition. It goes back more than 45 years. It does a couple things. One, it celebrates the shrimping culture and heritage within McClellanville itself, but it is the Low Country Shrimp Festival, so we're able to highlight and really promote everything that makes the town of McClellanville what it is. We think about the shrimp fleet and going and getting together as family and having a great festival with music and of course all our shrimp boats too. So it was awesome having you and your family out there to ride along and see what it's all about from a different perspective.
And we got to eat some incredible shrimp. I think South Carolina, obviously I'm biased. I've been a low country redneck here for 12, 14 generations or whatever. But I honestly think South Carolina wild caught shrimp are by far the best in the world.
Yeah, and you may be biased, but I can add some color to that. Like I grew up in the Keys, so I'm used to eating Key West pink shrimp, which I think are good too. But when I moved up here to South Carolina, like our white shrimp, our brown shrimp, like it's just a flavor that's really unmatched. Like I think all shrimp in the U.S. is wonderful, but ours is on top.
For sure. So with shrimping, it's obviously been a huge hot topic lately in the news. I don't know if anyone's aware, but there's this thing going on in South Carolina we're calling it Shrimpgate. It's this huge deal. The story broke a few months ago where they went in and they genetically tested shrimp from, I think, close to 50 restaurants here locally in Charleston area and maybe a few other places around the state to figure out, are they serving local shrimp? And the numbers of folks not serving shrimp and maybe kind of, insinuating or having on the menu that they're wild caught local shrimp was staggering. I think it came back like 90% of the restaurants were not serving local shrimp. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, I think we kind of knew it potentially. Like I worked at some restaurants downtown, in college, stuff like that. And I remember going and we'd bring in the tilapia and then they'd have wild caught grouper on the menu. You know what I mean? But like the guys in the back of the house are like, yeah, no, this is coming in on the Cisco truck. This is definitely tilapia. This is not right to be mislabeling this stuff. So yeah, this has been a wild story. And now the SC Shrimpers Association is, saying, hey, what's going on? Why are we misleading consumers? But just give us a little color on
Sure.
What's going on in South Carolina with this Shrimpgate and just overview of it? Yeah.
Sure. So it has really caught the attention of a lot of folks because we said the quiet part out loud, right? We have long suspected, that restaurants were, selling shrimp as if they were local and wild caught. And, there was a time when maybe they could get away with that. But as the effects of it is that our shrimp fleet is depleting. It's shrinking, so we know who we sell to, so it's a little easier to know that was sort of going on when there's all these local restaurants that are saying they're serving wild caught shrimp when we know the ones that we sell to. And it wasn't until recently that Seed Consulting was a group of food scientists that developed a way to do that genetic DNA testing, and they went to multiple states. We were the 8th state. So, we knew when we saw in the news that it was going on. And, when they came here to the Charleston area, they tested 44 restaurants. Of those, only 4 were actually selling domestic wild-caught shrimp. The other 40, tested were, for, imported shrimp or shrimp that was, the Pacific white shrimp that obviously isn't here. It wouldn't be, something that's invasive that got caught on accident. So, we were like, okay, well, this has been going on and, they're raising the awareness and it makes a couple of headlines, but there's no accountability, right? We know this has been going on for,
years.
Probably 20 years,
years.
Right? But like nothing was being done about it. So we're like, why are we going to sit back and, just let them keep, taking advantage of us, and not just us as shrimpers, but the consumer too, right? They're paying the
100%.
premium.
I mean, it kind of pisses you off. You're like, just don't lie to us.
Yeah.
Because there are some other good products, even if it's a Gulf Coast product. Like, I love Gulf Coast shrimp, but just tell us they're from the Gulf Coast.
Right. And at the end of the day, we're not saying don't serve imported shrimp. Just don't, profit off our backs and undercut us by not buying our product. And let them know, say whatever you want. Say it's sustainably, responsibly farm raised or whatever the case may be, but don't call it, South Carolina wild caught shrimp
When it's not.
or local fresh shrimp when it's, been on a freezer for like over a year and came from India or Indonesia or Vietnam,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously wild caught shrimp are healthier for you. I think in the United States, we have these amazing ocean fed wild shrimp. I think I've told you this before, but as a kid, I used to go out with my great uncle, Gordon Gray. He was a shrimper in the Beaufort area. And it was just the most amazing experience. You get to go out, trawl for a couple days. I remember he would hang me by my ankles through the bycatch hole with those long ribbon fish for the dolphins to come up and eat the ribbon fish out of my hands. And I mean, it was hard work. You dump the nets and you have to sort through. I remember getting hit by jellyfish and you had to wear those long gloves that were probably down to here on me when I was that young. But it's tough work. Obviously fuel costs are high. There's a lot of stuff going against shrimpers in South Carolina. I think I read that, back in the early 90s, there was over 300 shrimp boats in South Carolina. And I know personally in my hometown in Beaufort, we used to have over 100, and I think we're down to like 15. So I think across the state, maybe probably less than 100 shrimp boats left because of that. But I think the most pervasive problem, obviously, was in the, late 90s, just this influx, like you're saying, of these cheap imported farm-raised shrimp from, like Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So, it's really around that time, to your point, like the 90s, around 2000, where they were able to really, the proliferation of imported shrimp, where they're able to scale up and have these big, ponds throughout, areas in Southeast Asia, but it's expanded globally. But around that time is when we saw that sort of shift, that paradigm shift from, sourcing local wild caught to, what's cheap and easy. And cheap and easy doesn't always necessarily mean good, right? We think about, you mentioned it, healthier. Our shrimp comes straight from these clean coastal estuaries. Like, we love it. And you talked about, going out as a kid. Like, it's definitely something that we do not only for a job and a living, but a passion too. Like, there's nothing better than going out there and, seeing the sunrise and all the different, sea life that you see out there. You'll see, dolphins, whales, sea turtles, sharks, everything out there in the ocean as you're going by, because you're making 2 knots, maybe 9 knots when you're traveling. So it's a nice slow cruise.
It's incredible.
But going back to the aspect, the difference of the shrimp, why it's healthier is they're growing in these ponds, and back 20 years ago there wasn't much regulation. There's still, unfortunately, not that much regulation. We could talk about that too, but they're building these ponds, trying to grow the shrimp as fast as possible. So what do? It's a crop. They want to protect it, so they chock it full of antibiotics, other chemicals and preservatives and things, where our shrimp, comes straight out of the ocean, goes onto a box of ice, goes to a freezer, and you're getting, fresh, pure, shrimp right from our estuaries.
No doubt. And, and I think the restaurants, are saying, hey, one, it's expensive, which is true. Like, I have a wholesale account with Crosby's Seafood downtown. And even at wholesale, a 5-pound block of shrimp's, $50, something like that. Whereas, you could probably get something off a Cisco or US Foods, flash frozen for a tenth of that price. So I think the disparity is huge in the pricing in that regard. But it's one thing to buy those shrimp, but just tell us that they're those shrimp. Mm-hmm. Don't lie to us. And that's what Shrimpgate, I think, is all about, and bringing awareness to that. And I think hopefully it's going to encourage restaurants everywhere, really, to buy local. And I think it takes a community effort to say, yeah, you know what? We're going to pay more for these shrimp because we're going to support our local fishermen. And we want to put something in our body that's actually good for us.
Yeah. Well, you bring up some good points about there being a premium for local wild-caught shrimp. But we've been competing a lot with that. So you see, and there's a couple reasons when you go to a place like a wholesaler or Cisco or U.S. Foods, we're competing a lot of time for cold storage space. Now, this isn't an exciting part of the conversation probably, but they import more shrimp than the U.S. consumer consumes in a year. So we're fighting also against
I did not know that.
What's called inventory overhang. So cold storage space is a premium, and you end up having to pay more because there's less space to store your product. But I would counter and think about Shrimpgate too from the standpoint of a lot of consumers are already paying the premium and thinking they're getting wild-caught shrimp. They're getting charged that premium at these restaurants.
That's so true.
And we think about what is a reasonable return on investment or reasonable return on a dish, by a restaurant. Sometimes they say 200 to 300%, on raw food cost is, a reasonable return for a restaurant because they have all this other, net expenses, right? So, if they charge, let's say, for instance, they bought our shrimp, right? And, I guess it'd be about $7 a pound, $7.50 a pound for a 21, 25, tail. But you see some of these restaurants charging like $15 for, half a pound of peel and eat shrimp. Well, with peel and eat shrimp, there's what's the cost associated with that as far as preparation, the other ingredients? It's pretty straightforward. So, if they're charging, $15 a plate, $7 a pound, 33 cents a shrimp, that it's $4, right?
Dude, you've got the math figured out, for sure.
So you're getting, about 200. Now somebody will probably go and figure out the correct math, but like 230, 240% return. I think that's acceptable, fair. And that's if they bought our shrimp. So they're selling the imported shrimp, or what's been tested and found to be by the food scientists, that this shrimp is imported, and they're charging that price. They could still be making that return if they had purchased, local wild-caught shrimp.
Yeah, and the other argument is that they can't get them year-round, and there's not enough shrimp to meet demand. Mm-hmm. But honestly, for that one too, again, like I can go to these local markets and get those 5-pound blocks of frozen Georgetown 21s literally year-round.
When you think about restaurants and everything they're doing, and how their menu may be spread across all these different cuisines and things like that, I try to think of like, okay, well, what was the thought process behind that? And maybe it's ease and convenience, right? And what I would say is, I went to the U.S. Foods store. This is sort of funny. We had a meeting with our lawyer, but beforehand, we were looking for a scale the other day. And so we went to the U.S. Foods store down here in downtown Charleston. And when you walk in, the first thing you see is a glass case of seafood. It's right there on display. And they have, the crab clusters, you have soft shell crab, lobster, and then a whole wall of shrimp, frozen shrimp in bags, because some restaurants like the IQF, shrimp in bags, others, there were boxes and blocks.
Right.
None of it was, domestic wild-caught shrimp. It was all their house brand and imported shrimp from India, like a whole wall of it. To find the shrimp they did have, because they did actually have, domestic wild-caught shrimp from the Gulf, you had to go around a corner, past, clams, past everything, right? And then you found another wall of shrimp. It wasn't all their house Aquastar product, but there were more shrimp. But then there was one little tiny corner, 2 rows up, all the way to the left, and it was 4 boxes of domestic wild-caught shrimp. Now, I would love to say it's because the demand was so great they sold out of it all, but it really just goes to show not only it's not necessarily an availability thing, but it's a marketing thing, right? They have where they make the most money, and I think there's an avenue in the future, hopefully, to work with places like U.S. Foods and Cisco, where we can provide shrimp to them so that the restaurants have an easier choice to pick, when they want to provide local wild-caught shrimp on their menu.
I definitely don't want to villainize restaurants
at all.
No,
not at all.
Restaurants are incredible supporters of everything, and they're trying to do what they can do to run their business as well. I think this is just a transparency is really what you guys are looking for.
Absolutely, and we want to support all the restaurants that are doing the right thing. They're getting hurt too, right? They're competing in that same space for fresh, local, wild-caught seafood, and they're paying the premium or whatever the cost is, but they're doing the right thing, and by the way, still being profitable. and they have other restaurants that are competing for those same diners to sit at their tables, and they're losing out on business potentially because the other folks are not necessarily doing the right thing. But so, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, how much it's important for us to really highlight the good restaurants and all the folks that support the industry. And going back to thinking about the consumer, there's a lot of folks out there that want to help us, and they're trying to help us by, thinking they're buying local, by asking the questions, hey, is this local? Is this wild caught? Did this come from here?
That's great advice. Definitely ask.
Yeah.
I remember the big thing when I was a kid on my mom's back of her minivan, it was this sticker said, friends don't let friends eat imported shrimp.
Yep.
So I think what we're going to do for the month of September, I would like to make a donation to the SE Shrimpers Association and buy like 3,000 of these stickers from you guys. And in every package that we send out from Toadfish in September, we'll include that bumper sticker for you guys.
That'd be awesome.
So yes, stand by that. We definitely want to support you guys. Let's switch gears.
Sure.
I think the Shrimpgate thing, it's just such a complex issue. And I'm really interested to see how it all ends up. And I think it just captured everyone's attention because it was so pervasive. And I think it's like that thing where we've kind of known it for years. If you're local people and you're like, you knew some of these restaurants are, not serving local seafood, and whether they were advertising that or not, is to be determined. But I don't think we're going to solve it here on this podcast, but it was interesting to hear your perspective and where you guys are coming from. And I would just encourage our listeners, just, like you said, ask those questions. Where's your seafood coming from? And support local fishermen. And so one thing too that I wanted to, as we switch over to more of the conservation and more of the shrimping side of this, I think a couple myths that I wanted to talk about, because growing up we heard it a lot as well. Folks would say, these shrimpers are out there, they're trawling the bottom, and they're just destroying the environment. What are these shrimpers doing? This is bad for the environment. And for me, when I was growing up, I remember, you're killing all these sea turtles, this and that. But I think it's evolved so much with technology over the last couple of decades that I know that y'all have turtle excluder devices. Those came out back in like probably the 90s or 80s. I don't think any sea turtles are being caught. And then the shrimpers that I know are shrimping in the right areas. They're not, talk to us a little bit about shrimpers and can be conservationists.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you bring that up because they're every couple of years there's a documentary, right, that casts this wide net, pardon the pun, on bottom trawling. And the idea of bottom trawling, if you think about how we catch shrimp is, and I'll explain it real quick. There's two doors, that kind of act like planes, when you're fishing with a planer that dives down, but these doors hold the nets open. And the bottom of those doors, they kind of slide and glide across the bottom. And then there's, it's called an otter trawl, where there's a net with wings, and it's big like, think of it as like an envelope, skimming across right above the bottom, and a tickler chain that bounces to get the shrimp to pop up. But, the last thing we would want to do is, destroy the bottom, destroy our environment, and we could talk more about that. But, it's very, we try to be as environmentally sensitive as possible because we want a resilient, area where a sustainable fishery, because if it's not there, then we can't go shrimping the next year. And we've been doing this type of fishery for, over 100 years. When the Portuguese and the Greeks and the Italians came over and showed them how to do it in a single rig, back when there were still steam engines, they were doing bottom trawling, and if it was so destructive, there would be no more shrimp, right? If we think about like how we catch shrimp. But to your point, we've evolved because it's important to do that, and understanding the importance of the environment by including things not sometimes begrudgingly, right? If we think about the history of change and being a little resistant to change with things like TEDs, but we found that when you make a good turtle excluder device,
Okay.
But when we find that you work together and find the one that works, you can limit like the bycatch, or you can reduce the amount of crop loss or the yield by having a good working TED. So this TED, the turtle excluder device, is basically it's either a hoop or a square with bars in it, and it's going at an angle along with the net as you're pulling through the water, again around 2 to 3 miles an hour. And if a turtle's in there because they see a lot of good food, right, they're fast enough to swim away. But let's say, for instance, that they're seeing all this shrimp and fish being sort of funneled towards the back end of a net, and they're kind of going in for a free meal. They'll hit the bars and they'll go right out the top. The top will have flaps on it, top or
it's
the
like
bottom.
the weight. They just hit it and excludes them, right?
Exactly. They hit the bars and go straight out the top.
100%.
And then, they're back there for fish, and it's important to note that there's also, bycatch reduction devices. We call them fish eyes. They're little, basically, cones that are in the net that allow fish to swim out. Again,
I
because
didn't know that. That's awesome.
So we're required to have that as well. So we're very, intentional about trying to reduce bycatch, because it's not that we want to catch all these croakers or definitely not like juvenile redfish or sport
that was
fish.
one thing that I was like that I always push back on folks, because like obviously my family comes from a shrimping background as well, and I don't ever remember catching any redfish in the net. No speckled sea trout, almost none. I would say the only species like game fish that we would catch, and I don't even know if it's really a flounder, but we would catch a lot of juvenile fish that looked like flounder. So maybe they were juvenile.
Those are like
flounder.
hogfish or tonguefish. No, they're like a species that look like flounder.
They're not though, right?
No.
Yeah.
But they lay on the bottom. They look just like them. They're almost a diminutive like species,
Right.
and they're one of the ones that is determined to be a species of least concern. Sometimes they're called hog chokers because they're kind of rough. They're almost like sandpaper. But we don't want to catch additional fish because it's additional work for us. We want just the shrimp.
Just the shrimp,
So
yeah.
it's great to have these things that make it more efficient for us and cleaner drags. And when we think about where we go to, as far as where we drag, we think about places or I kind of mentioned documentaries, casting this wide net, saying how we destroy the bottom. And there's one that always sticks with me, and it was Seaspiracy. And
What's that?
Seaspiracy.
Okay.
It was a huge Netflix documentary, but it made this, this comparison to bottom trawling as far as destroying the equivalent of the Amazon rainforest and seagrass beds. I was like, well, we don't trawl in seagrass. That's not where the shrimp are. Where we are, it's sandy bottom. So I would say it's more akin to you build a sandcastle at the beach, waves come, knock it down. It looks just like it did before. That's kind of how we operate as far as where the shrimp are here off South Carolina. And defending other fisheries, we don't want to drag our gear across areas that can hurt our nets and destroy our nets.
Yeah, right.
Too.
Like you're not trolling across like a coral reef or like a hard reef, because it would just destroy
put
your
holes in the
nets.
net. Yeah, and they're like
100%.
$4,000 each. So we're not interested in destroying it. And that's just the nets. Think about the chain, the gear, the doors. Like we don't want to ruin our gear from a purely economic standpoint, but also going back to the ecological standpoint, we don't want to destroy the fishery either. So we want to harvest shrimp where they are when they're of a marketable size too. And so I think this is a good segue into how do we determine that, and that is our tri-net. So we have a smaller net that we pull alongside our larger nets. Our larger nets can be 25, 35 feet wide, but then we have like a little 10-foot net that we drop
smart.
down, and we drop it right between the two nets or 4 nets depending on the boat. And we usually pull that for 10, 15, or 20
Just
minutes.
get a little sample and say, and then you pull it up and you're like, hey, these are a little small. Let's move to the next spot.
Exactly.
Because then you're not wasting, because you don't have a market product that's not viable with those small shrimp, and you're also not killing things that you don't need to kill.
Yeah, 100%, Casey. So, one, it's about, the marketability. Are we catching shrimp that are too small? If we are, we can't sell that. We don't want to push them overboard. We don't want to lose ones that are actually growing right now that we could potentially catch later. And at the same time, we want to move to the place where we can catch a shrimp that we can sell to the dock, whether it's or sell directly to consumer, where it's a marketable size. And so these tri-nets allow us to be more efficient. Additionally, if there's things that don't get through the TEDs and the fish eyes, like croakers or some small spots or cannonball jellyfish, that really helps us determine, okay, do we move? Do we shorten our length of our trawl? Like, because sometimes, you'll get the jelly balls in there, but also the shrimp are mixed in. And so like, okay, well, you can stay in that area, but now instead of a 2-hour tow, maybe we switch it to an hour and a half or 1 hour because we don't want all that pressure pushing against, the shrimp.
Yeah,
so we're
and you
very
got the
intentional.
labor, and you got the labor to sort them out.
Exactly.
All the time. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about originally, though, but are there times of the year where the shrimp are so thick and you guys are going out catching shrimp from a market perspective? Is there times when there's so many wild shrimp out there, but you get back to the dock and there's not a market to sell them? Is there a demand issue now because of the pressures of imported shrimp where you're like, there's a ton of shrimp out there, but we can't go tomorrow because there's no demand for them? Does that happen?
And unfortunately, and part of the pun, it's shrimptomatic, right? It's symptomatic of the imported shrimp crisis. Absolutely. So, there were times, particularly last year during roast shrimp season where it was so thick, but we can only go shrimping 2 days or 3 days. And that was at, the benevolence of the docks where they're like, hey, we want you guys to go out there and make money, but we have nowhere to move this. We can only insulate you from so much of this pressure, but we have nowhere to go with the shrimp. So, we could have been, shrimping for 4 or 5 days when it was nice and thick and really strong. But because of, the inventory overhang, some of the stuff we talked about, that inventory pressure, the ability to move it.
I couldn't believe that you say that we import more shrimp than we actually even consume, just from an import perspective. That blows my mind.
Yeah, and what would be interesting to note is the millions and millions of pounds that were actually just brought in to try to front run the tariffs from India. India imported, they saw the tariffs coming, and I don't want to talk too much about that because, that tariffs are probably, in the long term, maybe a temporary fix to a long-term problem. But in order to
offset the tariff, they just front.
They're like, let's get them in, import them.
Flood of imported shrimp within the last few months, just getting ahead of those tariffs. So now we're coming up in September, October. I don't. You're the shrimper, but I mean, for me, October was always the best shrimping month of the year. Is that kind of still the?
Yeah. So in South Carolina, it's interesting. There's like 2 shrimp seasons within our season, right? And there's the roast shrimp season, which happens in the spring, late spring, early summer. And then it sort of slows off a little bit, and then it picks right back up, as you said, September through January. And September, October, November, that's some of our strongest times. So if we think about this flood of inventory coming in, and now we're competing against that, they're going to try to offload that as quickly as possible. And that's some of the things we're competing against. And that is unfortunate, but I think it goes back to the more important thing is like the consumer awareness and knowing what they're getting and what's of interest to them. What motivates the consumer to want our product, and I think highlighting some of the freshness and the benefit versus the imported shrimp is, I think, where we'll have
more success.
But yes, those are some of the pressures.
You can't fight that.
Right.
Like it's gonna.
You can't legislate your way out of it.
It's expensive and hard. I think the easiest way, like you're saying, what's probably expensive too, but is to try to change the hearts and minds of the consumer to choose the fresh local product over the imported product.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things is there has been this shift to people wanting to know like this the traceability or the source of their food, where it's coming from. Not just shrimp, but all kinds of things. You think about like vegetables, meat, things like that, but seafood in particular, because it's so complex, right? If you think about like when they buy Argentinian royal red shrimp, that are wild caught down there, do they know that it went through China to be processed, sometimes using forced labor? And that's been well documented by the BBC. That they use the Uyghur population, the minority Muslim population in processing plants, and then the North Korean dissidents in the Yao Ming province in northern China in these processing factories. So you're buying wild-caught, Argentinian shrimp, and you're looking at that on there, but did you know that it went through
Dude,
all
you're
those?
such a wealth of knowledge. I literally could just
I
just learned about all this all day long. This is so wild, and it's wild how global this industry is. I mean, shrimp's it's got to be the number 1 seafood in America. 100%.
It's the largest seafood globally if you think about like seafood protein. So, outside probably the kosher diet, I think shrimp is universal. Whether it be fresh warm water shrimp like ours that we're talking about here, or even cold water shrimp like you get in the Pacific Northwest. Like the smaller salad shrimp that you see. But think about it, like you think Latin American cuisine, Middle Eastern cuisine, European cuisine, just fried shrimp in America.
Gravy,
yeah, our Southern cuisine. Yeah, like you'll sound like Bubba from Forrest Gump,
and potatoes.
Yeah, exactly. Like we could go on that list and all the puns, but yeah, it's global. And you see that when you think about like, okay, where are shrimp farms? And they're not just sending them here. They're sending them to European Union, to Canada. There's shrimp farms in Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Ecuador is the biggest growth market for shrimp imported to the United States. But they're not all coming here. It's not just the United States. I mentioned, China, for example. They import shrimp because they're the number one consumer. We're the number 2 importer of shrimp. But you'll see that, when I talk about the risks and things associated with imported shrimp, those risks don't exist in places as much in places like Canada and European Union because they inspect the product more. So they inspect them for the banned chemicals and antibiotics. Here, the scary thing, and I don't want to scare people away from eating shrimp because we need consumers to eat shrimp. But when you think about like less than 1% to 1 to 2% are actually inspected, that
oh my
here
gosh.
in the United States,
that's wild.
That's really one of those stark, eye-opening, statistics.
So we're bringing in 99% of our shrimp, and we're not inspected. There's no regulation around the inspection of the product.
Yeah, there's regulation. It's just not actually being done or enforced. And there could be a myriad of reasons, right? There's not enough money or resources. I think it really comes down to interest. If people were concerned, the government would respond. But it's one of those things that's really, telling as far as the risk associated with food safety and having a resilient food supply.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a senator from Louisiana who's always got like this witty responses and catchphrases and everything, Senator Kennedy. And he had the former Commerce Secretary before their committee, and he asked her. She's in charge of NOAA and in charge of the commerce and trade. And he asked her, the statistics about, did you know that less than 1% is inspected, and of that, a third is found to be deficient, whether it be banned chemicals like or antibiotics like chloramphenicol and nitrofurans, or just filth, which includes salmonella.
That is, but it sounds just scary.
Yeah, right. Like it's stuff you don't want in your food that you don't get when you catch the shrimp out here. But those are things that they put into those ponds because they want to grow them quickly and don't want to have crop loss. So it's one of those mitigating factors they use. That is, there's actual rules in place, but if there's nobody there to enforce the rules, like what's the downside? It's like speeding, getting a speeding ticket.
I'm not familiar with the shrimp farms, but I travel. I've been traveling in Asia for the last 10 years. I go every year for like a week or two. And those tilapia farms, like I was like telling my wife, I was like, I would not feed this to my dog. Like, please do not eat tilapia. And if there anything similar to how that, you're like driving down the middle of, major cities, and you'll see these little ditches off the side of an interstate, and they're like tilapia farms, and there's all the runoff from the road and anything else, and these stagnant little ponds that they're growing these, aquaculture in. And obviously it's not good for you.
Yeah, and that, like I said before, the industrialization of it, the scaling up of it, making it so big, that they're profiting from it, so that's why they're doing it, and they're profiting from a couple. And this is so interesting that we talk about how shrimp can be such a global thing. Is that a lot of it comes from our tax dollars too, which is crazy if you think about that.
Wow, how?
Yeah,
how
so it's a good question. So there's the International Monetary Fund and other international monetary institutions that want to support capitalism in these fledgling democracies. Think like Ecuador. The majority of their shrimp farms were financed through the International Monetary Fund by us financing it. And so our tax dollars are going to contribute to it, which, in a perfect world, I guess you'd say, well, maybe it was going to support their food supply and feeding their people. But instead, it's turning around, they're selling it back into our country, and it's hurting our domestic shrimpers. So that's well documented. I think the Southern Shrimp Alliance, the group that funded the study for the DNA testing for Shrimpgate, they actually put out a report. It's called A Crisis of Our Own Making, where they documented the whole follow the money trail, right? Yeah, the money trail to show that we were doing that. And there's been legislation introduced, to ban members from voting in favor of something that would hurt domestic industries. But there's so many pieces of legislation in Congress. But we know how a bill becomes a law. It's like it's not going to save our industry.
Again, like that's how I did. I like in college I worked with CCA South Carolina and worked through their whole lobbying process, and so it like made me like that's great to spend money and try to do those things, but it's just such an uphill battle. Whereas like to me, not the solution, but the main thing that you can do in this problem is to educate consumers and, like I said before, win the hearts and minds of people to go to the store, ask the right questions, and pay a little bit more and purchase a wild-caught, South Carolina, North Carolina, Gulf Coast product that's better for you. That's the way we win here, because it's so hard. Like that when we give the majority of our money to building exact oyster habitat. We don't do lobby. We don't like to give money to a lot of people that have big lobbying parties to try to do this or that. I want to spend our nonprofit dollars on something tangible. Like, hey, we put this oyster reef, put a pin on it on the GPS. We built this. It's in an area that's closed for harvest. It's going to filter water for the next 100 years. Like, that's the purpose of that money. And with this, I think, from that perspective, anything we can do to raise awareness and educate consumers to buy the right product, I think that's where we need to be focused.
Yeah, and I love it, and particularly as you mentioned, something tangible, and that's actually how I got into shrimping, because I wanted to do something more tangible with my life, and I went out on the shrimp trawler, like the boat I ended up buying, was built in 1958, and I moved to McClellanville. I was like, well, what am I going to do now that I live here? And it was a beautiful town. I went out one time on this boat and fell in love with it, and it was
That's amazing.
there, and it was something tangible. I'm bringing food onto the deck of my boat, selling it, and then people are actually eating it and enjoying it, and it's something you can be proud of, and to see, to your point, where your money goes and resources that you're giving back to the community or the environment, and you can say, here's this oyster reef, and this is a keystone species that's keeping the estuaries clean,
and they're all connected, right?
Everything's interconnected.
So with shrimp, so you have this early season, probably like February, March, when they're spawning offshore.
A little later,
and then those little, larvae float into our estuaries.
Yep.
And where do they grow up? Right? On the oyster beds in the Spartina grass that, we all love and enjoy. And then, so those shrimp, is that the brown and the white that time of year, or it's different? I know there's different types of shrimp. I'll let you explain. You're probably better at the whole life cycle story, but from my understanding, the shrimp, they spawn offshore. They float in the creeks. They grow up in the creeks during the summertime, because you see them out there. You're throwing the net, and they're just getting bigger and bigger. And you're like, oh, that's a good bait-sized shrimp. And then they start moving out where they're down in the deep holes in our creeks, and you can catch them there. And then they push more like offshore again, right? And that's when you guys come in and can get them in the nets. The bigger, what do they live? Maybe I think like 8 to 10 months is the total life cycle of a shrimp.
Yeah, for full disclosure, I'm not a biologist.
Okay, that's fine. Neither am I. I'm just a redneck, but I've learned a lot of this stuff.
But yes, you pretty much hit all the salient parts about how they spawn in the cycle. So we're fishermen too. So when we're not on our shrimp boats, we'll be out fishing in the marshes. Bringing our children out there too. And yeah, you'll see during the tide changes, you'll see like the little tiny juvenile shrimp, just going along the oyster bed right on the water line, because they don't want to be any deeper to, be near, the fish, and then the fish don't want to be there near the dolphin, and there's that whole life cycle. But with the shrimp, you're absolutely right with the timeline and the process, where we're actually targeting the larger commercially viable shrimp, and they go offshore, they spawn, they lay their eggs, they hatch. Then those hatchlings turn into all these different sort of, minuscule, like tiny little organisms, some protozoa, and then they move in, attach, and they kind of, float around the Spartina grass, the oysters, and as they grow, they become juveniles, and then the juveniles grow quickly. And the life cycle, why I say I'm not a biologist is because, when you do your research, you're pretty much spot on as far as the time it takes them to be commercially viable. But their life cycle, typically, is, we say, about a year, but there have been some that have been measured at 2 years that attach themselves to rocks and jetties and things like that. It's really tough to put a tracker on that and measure the life cycle of a wild shrimp. Because they are the food to everybody, right? We're not the only ones that love them, but every sea creature out there, loves to eat a shrimp. That's why it's the number one.
And then in
bait
terms
product.
of our native populations, I mean, from what I'm seeing, they're really strong. I don't know if you guys have any data, but
Absolutely.
I think the big impact, right, is cold winters, right? That's the biggest thing that impacts the shrimp for that season.
Yeah. So there's two main factors, and the weather is the number one. Anything else can be attributed to environmental factors that attribute to the risk of a shrimp population. So what I mean by that is, there's the weather component, and then there's the human component. So the human component can be things like the Deep Horizon oil spill, right, in the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America. And I want to make sure I get that right. And then it could be a runoff or the infiltration of a huge freshwater event.
Yeah, I was going to mention
like
that.
a hurricane,
a lot of rain,
Yeah.
Can impact them. But in general, I mean, year over year, the South Carolina shrimp population is fantastic.
Yeah,
What I'm seeing.
and that's a testament to not only the resilience of the shrimp themselves, but also an intentional collaboration with the Department of Natural Resources and our South Carolina shrimpers. Because in order to open the season, we aren't static as far as the calendar, as far as when the season opens and when it closes. We work with biologists from the Department of Natural Resources, and what they do is they come out on trawls with us. They have their own research
Really?
vessels. They have nets inside coastal estuaries to sort of monitor not only brown and white shrimp, but also pink shrimp too, which we don't catch much here because they move offshore. But one of the things that's neat to note is when they do come out on our shrimp boats, they measure the size of the shrimp that we catch, and then also they measure the ovarian cycle and how many times they've spawned before they open the roe shrimp season. So they'll see, okay, and they have these little charts in this diagram. So it's neat to see them in action.
So they're using you guys to determine when, they're going to open the season or when, bait shrimp season, because it always changes a few weeks,
Right.
Depending on water temperature and stuff like that.
Absolutely. So water temperature is a big determinant, but then also, how many times they've spawned, if there's been enough to support the coming, crop, if you will, or the new spawning of the shrimp and what we'll have in the fall season. So remember, I said there's sort of two seasons. There's the spring and then the fall to through winter. Those are the shrimp that it spawns. So they actually grow pretty quick.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew that, but I don't think if you're still paying attention to this, that's really interesting. It's the shrimp that spawn in the beginning of the year, or then their offspring are what we're harvesting in
That's right.
October, which is interesting.
Yeah. So it's neat to see, in the whole process, and it's a testament to the collaboration too, because we want, again, and I don't want to sound like I'm, too redundant or beating a dead horse, is if we're doing our due diligence and collaborating with them, we're only strengthening our ability to catch more, and higher quality shrimp so that we can provide it to the consumers, sell it, make a living, provide for our families, and then just have something good to eat too.
No doubt. And bait season is right around the corner too. I just got my license the other day. I do some of that with my daughter. We love to go out and do the bait shrimping in September as well, which is really fun.
So I'm a little jealous. I don't get to do that as a commercial fisherman. But we do see the bait shrimpers in the inshore waters. Our trawling area is typically more offshore, and depending on where we are in the state, it could be a quarter mile to half mile off the beach. Or there's some places seasonally where, let's say Bull Island or Cape Romaine, where you can actually go up closer to the beach, but you can't go in Bull's Bay, for
100%,
example,
100%.
Or up in the Santee River. But it's neat to see the folks out there in their center consoles, their skiffs, and everything, putting the poles down and catching the shrimp.
Yeah, it's fun. So I think that about wraps it up. I think it was incredibly interesting to hear from your perspective what's going on with the shrimp in the state of South Carolina. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Brian. And eat local. Just support your local shrimpers. Support the South Carolina Shrimpers Association. Ask questions at the restaurant. Where are these locally caught shrimp? Where do these shrimp come from? And just support your local shrimpers. Support South Carolina. and eat some amazing seafood. I hope you enjoyed this month's podcast. Before you go, I wanted to share a quick little gear thing with you from Toadfish. So this was a really cool project. I had never designed an everyday carry pocket knife before, but we launched this last Christmas, and it's just one that I carry every single day and use a ton now. So what's special about it? It's a Swiss blade, and it's got the quick draw release, which I really love. You can see how quickly you can pop that out. I did a G10 handle material mixed with carbon fiber. So it's just a really, really elegant design. You can see the side carry clip here, easy fold down. This has been a really, really good seller for us. And it's a simple design, it's elegant, but it's really useful, whether you're out on the boat or you're going camping, or just anytime you want to have a pocket knife. This is a great little item to keep on you. So check it out. It retails for $100 on toadfish.com. That's the everyday carry Toadfish pocket knife.